So much of American politics is a battle over words, a contest for who can define an issue and define what success means. We're breaking down Bidenisms. That's our phrase for pretty basic political concepts that the Biden White House over the last few months has been trying to redefine. In the last few years, in the Trump era, we were used to a completely chaotic style by Donald Trump, where he sort of made it up as he went along. This is a much more deliberate White House. And their style when it comes to shaping public opinion, it's not the mass disinformation of the Trump era, thank God. But in their own way, like to play games with language. What does bipartisanship mean? What is the nature of a crisis? And when should the press use that word? What is infrastructure? Sometimes there's even a fight between the press and the White House over numbers. So first up, bipartisanship and how we talk about it and define it in the press is really important to the Biden White House. Why? Because Biden promised to be bipartisan. There's one problem with that. If you define your presidency's success as whether or not it was bipartisan, you are ceding an enormous amount of power to the other party, because all they have to do to make you a failure is not give you those bipartisan victories. Democrats learned this the hard way under Barack Obama. Similarly, Obama won the presidency in 2008 after a very divisive 8 years of George W. Bush by promising to bring the country together.
Here's what I would do immediately. I would convene a continuous advisory meeting with not just Democrats, but Republicans.
So fast forward to 2021, Biden once again promises bipartisanship. So they decided to come up with a new way to think about bipartisanship. The White House has a legislative strategy of using this process in the Senate of reconciliation. The first time I saw this defined by the White House, and I think it was very deliberate on their part, was in an on-the-record quote by Biden's top communications advisor. Anita Dunn very cleverly defined bipartisanship as not support from both parties' elected officials, but support from both parties' voters. And when they're asked about bipartisanship, as long as they can point to a poll that shows some Republican support, that's good enough. The next Bidenism we want to talk about is the word crisis. This is where we get into the subjective nature of some of these debates about definitions. Usually, politicians use the word crisis because they want to identify the urgency of an issue. So, for instance, the Biden White House has talked about the climate crisis. It's talked about the housing crisis. It's talked about the caregiving crisis. But recently, when there was what is genuinely an annual surge of migrants coming from Central America, the Biden White House stubbornly refused to describe it as an immigration crisis. Now, even the White House hasn't been totally consistent about this.
That they would be partners in dealing with the crisis on the border.
When you were talking a moment ago about diplomatic negotiations between the United States and Mexico, you said crisis on the border. Was that a
challenges on the border?
Okay, but so that doesn't reflect any change in the administration's view of things.
Nope.
Okay.
While the Biden White House has been steadfast in not talking about the migration crisis, not using the C word, Republicans have done the opposite. It's sort of been up to us in the press to sort this out and to figure out, are you being partisan if you use the word crisis, or are you just being factual? A turning point came recently in the New York Times when the paper of record did a big piece on what's going on at the border, and by my count, used the word crisis 4 times. From the White House's perspective, once you've lost the Times, you've kind of lost the battle. So the next front in the Bidenisms war is infrastructure.
200 years ago, trains weren't traditional infrastructure either. until America made a choice to lay down tracks across the country.
The White House wants to use an extremely expansive definition of what infrastructure is. Republicans want to use a very narrow definition. Biden's recent infrastructure bill includes about $2.5 trillion of spending. Less than half of that is devoted towards spending on what's traditionally in American politics been described as infrastructure: roads, bridges, ports, airports. But when you start getting into federal facilities at the VA, hospitals, community colleges, those are things that are physical, but they're not usually what was thrown into the infrastructure category in previous political debates. What he's trying to do is use something that is really popular as the catch-all phrase, and frankly, to smuggle in some other Democratic priorities under that popular label. At least that's the Republican argument. The final Bidenism is probably the silliest one. And this is the redefinition of 100 days. Since FDR, every president has been judged by his accomplishments in his first 100 days. The Biden White House wanted an extra day. So by most counts, 100 days will be April 29th. So they are defining 100 days as April 30th. Their excuse for this is that the first full day was January 21st. I noticed that Democrats and Biden stands get very, very mad and think that the press is being overly pedantic and that these aren't really important criticisms. And I disagree. When people in power try to massage language, it's pretty important for the press to take note of that. And maybe at the end of the day, most of the American public doesn't care. But one thing we should always be on the watch for is people in power playing word games, because if they feel like they can get away with redefining a concept here and there and that nobody notices or cares, then they'll move on to taking advantage in other ways.